as she mentioned, there's a wide range of knowledge that sits up here. To my right or left, Bilal has more of the technical knowledge. Alex, especially, and Adam, obviously having that data science background. But Adam and I, we're here to talk about the future of how blockchain will impact the sports industry and sort of business as a whole. And I think that Adam and I, coming from different parts of sports media and entertainment content consumption, have a different perspective on those pieces. There are lots of ways that we hear about blockchain today, and I think that sports is no exception. And there's many ways that it's going to impact it, and hopefully we can touch on a lot of those today. I think that one of the first pieces to really set a baseline of what we'll talk about is to sort of introduce blockchain as itself. There may be, how many people in here would say they're an expert on blockchain? All right. How many people would say that they're somewhere in between an expert and a novice? Okay, that's good. How many people are a novice? Who knows nothing? Literally nothing. Okay, that's good. That's good, right? And I think that the reason that's really good is because it's still evolving. And the technology is pretty tried and true, but how it's applied to business and sports business, especially, is still evolving. And I think that that's what's interesting for all of us sitting in this room of how we can do that going forward. So we'll set a baseline around what blockchain is and sort of the ins and outs of that, talk about its application to sports and how that could shape it going forward, and then leave room for some discussion, some open-ended questions about not only how it can be applied, but some of the legal, ethical, existential questions that come into that. So, as mentioned, to my right is much more the technical knowledge, so I will let Alex talk about blockchain as a whole.
Sure. So by far the most famous and most recognized application of blockchain is in cryptocurrency. It's in Bitcoin. I'm sure all of you have heard Bitcoin this, Bitcoin that, especially earlier this year when Bitcoin famously crashed from $20,000 to, it's something like $7,000 now. It is really important to understand, though, that cryptocurrency is not blockchain and blockchain is not cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is based on blockchain. So the technology behind blockchain itself is fundamentally at a high level like a ledger. And each block is kind of like a record in that ledger. Essentially, it is a distributed, meaning passed on between lots of different places. Secure, it's based on cryptographic hashing techniques, basically strong mathematics that keep it very safe. Databases, that's fundamentally what they are, records of transactions, ownership stakes, and they are, they can be used to be pretty transparent at the same time. Everybody can theoretically see all of the records in that database. Briefly, I want to touch on a high level what makes them secure, and that's back to kind of the mathematical problems. There are a set of pretty intractable for current computing technology, a set of mathematical problems usually based around like integer factorization into prime numbers. I mean, they sound easy when you're dealing with numbers that might be 3 digits, 4 digits, even 10 digits long, but when you start getting up into 1,000-digit prime numbers, it takes 1,000-digit prime numbers and then factoring even bigger numbers into those components. It takes computers a long time to do that. They are pretty inefficient. And so, I just did some back of the envelope calculations before this, using the entire power of the Bitcoin mining network, which, keep in mind, I think at most recent estimates took about 1% of the global power consumption, which is absolutely crazy. It would still take longer than, the universe has been around for 13 billion years. And it would take many, many orders of magnitude longer to break the encryption Bitcoin is based on by brute force methods. So for all intents and purposes, these things have the ability to be fundamentally secure. So then we move on to what is a block, what is a chain, what do these terms mean? So a blockchain is, funnily enough, a chain of blocks. Each block has information about the previous block and then is securely hashed into the next one. And you can, each block has information about the transactions, the ownership stake, about all of the places on the network, all of the nodes on the network. It's got information about how much you have, about how much I have, about who sent money where.
And Alex, I think this is a really interesting point too, is that when we talk about the blocks that are in this blockchain, it's not just numbers that sit in them, right? There's information, correct?
Correct.
You don't have to just sit the numbers. A lot of people think of it as math and cryptography and all those pieces. It's not just numbers that sit in those blocks. Think of it in something, a great example that I saw was around supply chain management of diamonds. Diamonds is a hard thing to track. You want to do the legal and ethical pieces around it, but in that supply chain, you can track where it was mined, high resolution images of that, things around color, cut, clarity, all of those in each individual block. And then as Alex talked about, how it's cryptographically stored.
So yeah, that's a great example. And a lot of people, particularly in high risk things like supply chain management, they want to make sure all of that information, A, remains secure, and B, can't be further tampered with. So in a traditional ledger, let's just say you had a book, a row of records, rows and rows and rows of records. If I tear out page 40 and it just goes 38, 39, 41, nobody then has any idea about what happened on page 40. Nobody knows where, back to the diamond example, where this diamond came, let's say we have some information, it came from, Zimbabwe, and then we lose all the information and somehow it ends up in Great Britain or in America. With technological blockchains, because of the secure hash and the reference to the previous block, we have an unbroken, technologically secure chain all the way back to the primordial block, the very first block. So everything, it's called immutability. It can't be changed once it's happened. So yeah.
And then just building on what Alex said, the main idea when you're talking about cryptocurrency or in general is this decentralization of the platform. The founder of Bitcoin, what is it,
Satoshi.
Or founders.
or founders or whatever, who's unknown at this point. The main thing he was trying to address is that when it comes to banking, that every transaction has to go through some kind of centralized banking platform, which means whether it's the government or sometimes these payment services like PayPal have to monitor and charge you for a transaction. And using a decentralized platform, everybody can see every transaction, and you don't need to have somebody evaluate whether the transaction actually occurred or not, or if somebody's paying twice for something. And the way to incentivize this public, and Alex can tell you more about this as we go through the process, but the way to do that is through mining and computer mining, where computers basically have to solve these very complex, as Alex described, these very complex problems. And the first computer to do that is rewarded with whatever the current, whether it's Bitcoin, or we'll talk more about Ethereum later on, or either Bitcoin or a token or something that's valuable within the system, so that it incentivizes people to actually do the mining. And the reason that 1% of the world's energy is focused on Bitcoin is that people want Bitcoins, right? Because they've accrued in value in a significant way. And just a story about that, unfortunately for Alex, he bought very early into Bitcoin. Did you say 2010?
2010.
Yeah, how much did you buy?
I had 100 at about $1 each, and I made the best investment of my life and sold them at $40 each. And now I'm sitting up here.
Yeah.
instead of on a beach somewhere.
Right.
But
How long does it take to 1 to 40?
how long was that first?
Time frame?
That was probably over the span of a couple of months. If I remember right, I probably got into them at kind of maybe the middle of the year 2010. It might have been 2011, and then kind of the middle of the year after, I think I sold. Actually, this is one of the interesting challenges around cryptocurrencies. In the very early days, there were no exchanges that you could easily access with American dollars. So you had to find interesting ways of liquidating them. And so actually, I ended up having to sell these on eBay, which is very time consuming, very difficult. The first real Bitcoin exchange or cryptocurrency exchange, it was called MTGOX. Actually, they declared bankruptcy a while ago. They got hacked, and that's the first time Bitcoin ever experienced a real crash. It went from $40 down to 6 cents almost instantly, just because the only way people could exchange them for any kind of in any kind of financial way just vanished overnight.
Yeah. So there was a question over there, but before we do that, Alex isn't the worst investor. The first, or the most famous Bitcoin, or one of the most famous Bitcoin transactions is somebody paid 10,000 Bitcoin for a pizza.
Yeah.
So whatever that
Delivery
was. So that investment today, obviously, if you multiply whatever 7,500 times 10,000, that's how much he spent on a pizza. So
not delivering-
so
not
Alex
delivering-
isn't the worst off.
That person's not delivering pizzas anymore.
Yeah.
The question was around mining, the mining of the Bitcoins, correct? And what
Are
it,
they mining prime numbers? What in particular are they mining?
So it's a little bit, it gets a little bit technical. Basically, they're trying to solve, so Bitcoin is based on the SHA-256 algorithm, if I remember right. And that, I don't believe, is specifically related to prime numbers. I think that's actually based on a cipher. Essentially what happens is you're trying to find a viable solution to a mathematical problem. And the more difficult it gets to mine a block, the more difficult that problem becomes to solve, and the more time it takes. So just the best way to think about mining without getting too deep into the technical details is they're trying to solve very difficult problems for computers to solve, and the harder that problem gets, the harder it gets to mine, the more time it takes to mine, the more energy required to mine, et cetera.
Yeah, and essentially, each transaction, each person has a public, and particularly in this case, a public and private key. So what you're trying to figure out is using somebody's public and private key. So the public key is derived from the private key. So that way, it's and Alex, again, will know this better than I will, but it's relatively easy to go from the private to the public key. It is almost, or very, very, very difficult, if not almost impossible, to go from the public key to the private key. So your private key is basically like your signature. You do not want to give your signature away. Obviously, you do not want it to be copied or mimicked. Where the public key is kind of like your bank, in terms of money terms, is like your banking and account number, right? So somebody could see what that was. And the idea with mining is to see, can we confirm a transaction has taken place within the context of whatever market or whatever process you're looking at.
So actually, I think this discussion, the questions and what we've been talking about is a really good kind of segue into what is a cryptocurrency more broadly, what defines a cryptocurrency, and how does it relate to different, how does it relate to something like a Venmo or a PayPal? So there are, I would say, 5 real attributes of a cryptocurrency as opposed to a fiat currency or something that a country would print. So the first is that it's totally virtual. Fundamentally, these are bits on a computer. They are pieces of data. I can't go to the local bank and I can't give them a Bitcoin, and they won't give me back gold. They won't give me back cash. A Bitcoin is, a cryptocurrency in general is, it's intrinsic to itself. The second thing is they are peer-to-peer. So it does not require a faith in an institution. It doesn't require a bank. It doesn't require an intermediary. I can send Bitcoin or cryptocurrency anywhere I want, and the rest of the network will verify that transaction for me, which kind of brings it to the third aspect.
Which I think, Alex, is a good point on the peer-to-peer piece. It's sometimes hard to conceptualize here, all of us sitting in this room in the United States of America, that the lack of trust in institutions. There are a lot of places around the world that people don't trust those banking institutions. They don't trust the governmental institutions. So there's a lot of applications. The creator of Ethereum is Canadian, and a lot of the applications are outside of in developing countries, in those pieces where the governments or the institutions aren't as trusted. So that's where that peer-to-peer gets really exponentially valuable.
Actually, kind of on that note, if you look at exchanges in A lot of like previously war-torn African countries, like in a Zimbabwe, you'll see the price of Bitcoin is actually higher there than in countries like America. And I think a lot of that has to do with faith in the institutions. The cryptocurrencies don't require faith in the institutions in order to operate. And part of the reason is the third aspect of a cryptocurrency is that it's decentralized. There's no, again, there's no intermediary, but then no one person can modify the ledger. No one person can change the blockchain. Everybody on the network has to agree. And so you'll start hearing about things like forking when two people or two groups of people don't necessarily agree on the best future of the blockchain or the best path for it to take. And so the chain remains unbroken, but it can still split in multiple different ways, but it's still decentralized. No one person ever has, in theory, control of the network. Fourth, they are theoretically anonymous. Some cryptocurrencies more so than others. There's a famous story of the Silk Road, which was kind of the first real way of using Bitcoins illegally. You could buy things like drugs and guns and all sorts of bad stuff on the dark web. And famously, the FBI, I think it was the FBI, managed to figure out they managed to track his particular public address back to him. So they are theoretically anonymous, but there can be some practical considerations for that. And some cryptocurrencies are better at it than others, but that's another consideration. And then last, they are theoretically secure. Obviously we just talked a little bit about how they managed to reverse engineer the guy's identity, but the mathematical algorithms behind them are also theoretically secure, kind of going back to that, the power and time it would require to just totally break those algorithms. The cryptographic hashing algorithms, they are, for all intents and purposes, secure unless there is a fundamental vulnerability, whether that's in the source code or somewhere else.
Yeah, and we've obviously spent a lot of time talking about cryptocurrency because, again, that is the most commonly used part of this. We've mentioned Ethereum up here. Ethereum is not necessarily currency. It's a peer-to-peer contract network. So the idea is you could send any type of contract across that. Bryce mentioned, a supply chain management, but one of the things that, moving from cryptocurrency more commonly would be used as some form of what's called a token. One example, it's just anything that would have value that could be traded. One example people have used, although you can correct me if I'm wrong, is like if you wanted to trade frequent flyer miles, you could trade frequent flyer miles on the Ethereum network. Ethereum, the whole concept behind it is to create this decentralized platform where you can exchange whatever it is you want to exchange on the platform. It does look like, as you can see, people are getting lunch too, so feel free to, we don't want to keep you from eating either, so feel free to go grab lunch.
So one thing to build on the Ethereum piece I saw yesterday was some apartments are doing rentals through using smart contracts that are on the Ethereum blockchain to say, if you meet these conditions, pay the deposit, the key is unlocked, you have the keys to the apartment, the rent comes at certain times, all those conditions are met. So it's a way to do that without some intermediary that's in between. So you see the potential of those things in lots of different applications. I think that one of the things that we're here to talk about today is obviously blockchain as a whole, and as Alex and Adam have mentioned, cryptocurrency is one that is very prevalent. We see that a lot. But how does that apply to sports, right? And you're thinking about that, if you start to think about all the things we've just talked about and how it can apply to sports, there's lots of different ways that you can apply it to sports. The number one, which Adam will dig down into a bit, is tickets. And just sit and think about how you could do the chain of command, the transparency in tickets. But other things that really come into play that could use the blockchain in a sports setting are things like content, consumption of sports content. We'll talk more about that. Sponsorship, which Adam and Alex have a vested interest in, and also experts know more than just about any around how sports sponsorship can be valued and it increases value for teams and sponsors alike. But also things from a sports perspective, like loyalty schemes and teams doing their own coins to incentivize fans. Anti-doping. the ability to have that transparency into the testing from a doping perspective. And then performance metrics and analytics and statistics. We talk a ton about data science and those types of things, but there's our applications of this in that. And so one of the biggest examples that we've talked about, or if you think about, is ticketing. And Adam and Alex had a recent blog post, who have actually their website, block6analytics.com. They have a great blog that has a ton of different items, but recently had a blog post around how blockchain could change the ticketing market.
Yeah, so one more thing just on the mining part of it. So in sports, so the Sacramento Kings became the first team to have to mine for cryptocurrency, apparently in the basement of the Golden One Center or something. The basement of their arena, they're mining for cryptocurrency right now. So, just in an application to sports context, you might see more and more of that stuff because sports, just in general, sports organizations are looking for new ways to diversify revenue streams, and being able to mine for, do these types of blockchain mining, whatever that, for now, for cryptocurrency, is something that sports teams are taking a look at. But the primary way that people think about blockchain in sports right now is through ticket sales. So one of the primary things with ticket sales is there's a primary market and a secondary ticket market. The primary market is when the team sells you the ticket, and more commonly, people are buying tickets on the secondary market, myself included. I recently bought a ticket to I probably shouldn't be saying this at a Northwestern event, but I recently bought a ticket for the Northwestern Duke game close to the field at I think it was $9 per ticket, which was not what the face value was. And that's the idea behind the secondary ticket market. The primary ticket market, the team sets the price. They are using more and more frequently what's called dynamic ticket pricing to look at different variables and try to set different prices for different games based off the demand. The secondary ticket market has been much more, so far to date, has been more successful at doing that. So if you think about StubHub or SeatGeek, those are the most commonly used secondary ticket markets. The problem from a team perspective is when tickets enter the secondary market, or even if you're just giving your ticket to your friend, it's often very difficult to track where the ticket is going or who's using the ticket. And a lot of sports teams don't even know who's in their actual building. And that's a big problem. We'll talk about it from a sponsorship perspective, is like not knowing who's in your building means you can't communicate that value to sponsors. But the team even from a ticketing, merchandise, or concession perspective, they want to know who's entering the building so that they can target those people, particularly people who are using tickets, who are not season ticket buyers, because they are more likely to purchase tickets in the future if you've seen that they've actually used your tickets. But if you have no idea if they're entering the stadium or not, then it's impossible for a team to really understand who their fans are. The idea behind blockchain, and this is where if you're talking about investment in sports right now, when it comes to blockchain, outside of gambling, which we can talk about also, but with tickets, that's the primary thing right now is tickets, because in theory, based on like what Alex was saying, having a decentralized platform where you could evaluate every single transaction, even if there were a secondary market, if you used a blockchain technology, then you could see every time a ticket is sold. And every time a ticket is sold, then you could see who that person, at least the public key or a version of that person was, who entered your arena. And that would fundamentally, teams then could know who's entering the arena, they can know who's selling their tickets, they can understand if there's counterfeiting going on, and they would be able to track that in a much clearer way. And then and we'll talk about this maybe more on the legal and ethical perspective, they then would be able to track and show to other people, whether it's marketers, sponsors, companies, who are the people that are actually coming to the arena, when they're coming to the arena, how frequently they've used tickets, how many times they've used the primary market versus the secondary market. There's all sorts of data that you could get in theory from the market. And also being able to see what's going on and capture more of the value of tickets is something that's of primary concern to teams right now.
I think something you said was probably one of the most direct and immediate applications of blockchain about the security. Mm-hmm. If I want to buy a ticket on Craigslist, how do I know that that's a real ticket? If I see a ticket for 1/10 of the face value, how do I know it's a real ticket or somebody who just really needs to liquidate that ticket? With blockchain, you can ensure that that's a real ticket. And this is kind of an open question. It comes to implementation details, but how do you release tickets on a blockchain? Do you use a cryptocurrency? Does one token equal one ticket?
Right.
Does, is there some novel implementation that we should think about? But, demographics are important. Figuring out who's got your tickets is important. But just from a user perspective, being able to have trust that what you're buying is real is I think pretty invaluable
Yeah.
for any sports
So
team.
yeah, exactly. And teams have implemented some things on that front. So one of the things that Major League Baseball is doing in particular, I mean, if people have been to airports and use, expedited security screening. You may have seen Clear as one of the expedited security clearance. And the idea with Clear is that they can scan your face or scan your body and then automatically know if you're on the approved list or not. Teams are starting to use that as well as a way to implement and figure out what's going on. Again, the problem with that is that you actually either teams have to buy Clear, you have to opt in to Clear, you have to be on their list, there's extra cost. So even then, and you still don't know, even if the person is using a ticket, how they got the ticket in the first place is still a problem. And that goes back to Alex's initial point. One of the things that StubHub and SeatGeek had to originally deal with is this counterfeit issue. So right now, StubHub and SeatGeek guarantees every ticket or you get your money back. The problem is, for a lot of fans, is like, even if I can get my money back, I still don't get to go to the game, right? So that is a huge problem. And recently that happened, and I forgot what the event was, but 65 people who bought tickets on SeatGeek or StubHub they got their money refunded, but they got counterfeit tickets and they weren't able to go to the game. And at a time when sports organizations are really struggling to get people to come to the venue, if people are at the venue and then they can't get in, obviously that is not an ideal scenario. So they want to make sure that they can really understand who's using the tickets.
And in no uncertain terms, blockchain lets you trace the lineage of that ticket all the way back to the arena that issues it. So this is, I would think that this is one of the most immediate and most useful and most kind of the lowest hanging fruit of all.
Yeah, for sure.
For blockchain and sports.
And I think that for many of those reasons, right? The ability, the security that you're buying something. As Adam mentioned, the security of, stadiums, especially in football, college football, have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the same place at once. There's an obvious level of physical security that's involved in that. So there, as Adam mentioned with Clear, there's a company called Rival that was started by the former CEO of Ticketmaster that's working to do tickets that are blockchain based, but then also biometric scanning when you enter the venue to ensure that you are that person that purchased that ticket. But then the other piece that Adam mentioned on the secondary market, you see tickets going for less value. But the flip side is a lot of times today, the secondary market has priced out the average fan, right? And so the ability for a team to issue those tickets and have the face value. Right? The last time you bought a ticket at face value. It's not very often, right? Whether that's lower or higher. And a lot of times in Chicago is a great sports city. So a lot of times tickets are much higher than the face value. That often comes because of the secondary market. Yeah. And so the ability to have the teams issue those tickets and the transparency, the sort of chain of command allows that ticket price to stay constant, and we can start to not price out the average fan and get more fans in the venues.
Yeah, I mean, actually, we'll talk, and Bryce in particular, counterfeiting or illegal activity in media is probably an even bigger challenge in sports, where blockchain could be a solution, and we'll talk about that in more detail because illegal stream or piracy of sporting events, given how much media companies are paying for the right to broadcast sporting events. So just as a context, the NFL teams right now from their distribution agreements get something like $225 to $250 million a year. Every NFL team gets that amount of money, and their player, the salary cap last time, I think is between $170 and $180 million, right? So if there's a compromise of the media piece where people can start accessing illegal streams for free, whether domestically or globally, that becomes a huge problem for the biggest revenue source for a lot of teams, particularly in the big four sports. But the other thing that the biggest issue, or one of the biggest issues with blockchain technology in sports is the fact that it is technology. The sports industry is notoriously slow for adapting technology. The reason that StubHub and SeatGeek exist is because sports organizations were very slow to adapt to dynamic ticket pricing, very slow to adapt to a secondary market. They've subsequently tried to enter the secondary ticket market, with varying degrees of success. They partnered with Ticketmaster at times to try to capture the value. But what they found is that that they're not, typically sports organizations are not going to be first movers when it comes to any new technology. And particularly given the only real way that they've seemed to have entered that space is through sponsorship, where either players or teams or athletes, like cryptocurrency companies, want to sponsor sports teams to reach those demographics. Whether they will implement the technology or it will take them a really long time to even consider the technology as an open question, I think it is unlikely that even though that crypto could be, as Alex has talked about, blockchain technology could really fundamentally alter one of their key revenue streams, which is ticketing, and yet they still will be slow to adapt it, even though that is something that could have a direct and immediate impact.
Which I think is a fundamental open space for everybody sitting in this room. Adam and Alex alike are examples of people that took advantage of sports slowly adopting different technologies and creating a business that helps value sponsorships from a sports perspective and from the sponsors themselves and activation in those. But there will be plenty of business opportunities for people to do different things around ticketing and or content consumption, the security pieces that leverage blockchain. Adam mentioned content. In my day-to-day job, I work at an interactive media company, and I guess as an example, we create the technology that powers services like a Hulu or an HBO Go or an HBO Now, those types of services. And as Adam mentioned, content today, currently in America, there are 639 television shows in development. It's a lot of content, right? But what's the most valuable content? What do you still watch live? Exactly. Which makes sports the most valuable content in the world. Because it's appointment television. Still, to this, news and sports and the Oscars are kind of the only thing that is really watched live. And because of that, the value of that is extremely high for not only the leagues and teams themselves, Adam mentioned the revenue that comes in from that, but also the broadcasters of that content. So it's a really interesting dichotomy in that today, cable companies have a stranglehold on how content is distributed. That may start to shift, and when that does start to shift, content can be delivered in different ways directly from that original content creator, done through more advanced means like using blockchain. And how that can be done, it really gives the security around it to know that you are this person that purchased this content in a microtransaction or whatever it may be. You are the person that is watching this content. This content isn't being recorded and rebroadcast somewhere else. So it gives those teams and leagues and the broadcaster of that content the security that the content is going where it's supposed to. On the flip side, as a consumer, lots of us pay cable companies, Comcast, Time Warner, Dish, DirecTV, lots of money. There may be a future world, we can hope, that you could buy those things directly in a sort of microtransaction piece, right? To say, I want to watch the Colts and the Ravens this weekend, and I can buy that directly, something done through blockchain to say Bryce has the key to watch this specific content. Sports is different in the sense that it's extremely valuable and everyone is compensated on all ends of that chain. But when you get to other types of content, a lot of those creators aren't compensated as well as they should be because they have to go to different distributors, whether it be a YouTube for some people that are creating their own content, television shows, the writers in those pieces. If you cut out those intermediaries that are there, those content creators, the talent involved, have the ability to garner more of the revenue because they can do it directly. And I think that some of these things from a content perspective, Adam and what they do at Block 6, it opens a really big opportunity from a sponsorship perspective because that will be one of the main revenue drivers because advertisements may fall out.
Yeah, and if you are curious a little bit more about this, like Bryce said, I do have it a little bit more detail in a blog post. So again, my company's name, or our company's name, Block 6 Analytics. Unfortunately, not Blockchain 6 Analytics because it'd probably be more valuable. But the main idea is just as again context. So ESPN, just the ESPN primary channel charges right now $7.99 per month per subscriber. At its peak, ESPN had 100 million cable and satellite subscribers. So if you just multiply 8 times 100 million times 12 months, right? That's something like $9.6 billion a year from subscriptions, right?
And you also think about your cable bill being $100 a month, $7.99
Right.
of that is for ESPN.
And these regional sports networks, most famously the Los Angeles Dodgers, whether it was through Time Warner and I think now through Spectrum, have a deal where the Los Angeles Dodgers, for their local broadcast, signed a 25-year agreement for somewhere between $7 and $8 billion over the life of that agreement. So if you're talking about, again, if this could be disrupted, obviously this is potentially an issue. As Bryce was saying, and this is where something like Ethereum, not necessarily Ethereum, but something like Ethereum, where if you can send essentially a contract where your acceptance of the contract is essentially your payment for the streaming or a payment for the content, that way the reason that they're called broadcast networks, right, is basically television like NBC, CBS, Fox, right? They broadcast a signal to as many people as who can hook up either cable TV or even over-the-air networks. As many people as it can pick up the signal could watch. Rather than doing that, you could, as the content provider, could just provide it to the people who want to pay for it, and that potentially again could disrupt the cable system because right now cable companies depend on you buying every customer paying for these regional sports networks and paying for the ESPNs. In theory, right, if the customer can figure out a way and the companies can figure out a way, there are certain companies that will do better, there are certain companies that do worse, but again, you'll be able to track every one of those transactions from a media perspective. And one of the biggest issues that comes up, and for people who watch sports, particularly if you watch golf over the weekend, if you watch Tiger Woods win over the weekend, one of the things that they've changed is these ad breaks, right? So rather than going away from the content, rather than going away and having a traditional television commercial, they're pairing it side by side. And the reason they're doing that is to better monetize the content, right? So they can sell advertising in addition to selling the subscription, particularly if you're NBC, right? NBC does not have subscription revenue on its main network. The only way or primary way it generates revenue is through advertising. Yet that disrupts the content, it disrupts the experience, it disrupts what the audience member wants.
Elongates the broadcast.
And causes the broadcast to be longer, exactly. And more frequently, people want a shorter amount of time. So the NBA is already starting to experiment with something like this, where now you can actually just buy the fourth quarter of a game. So if you only wanted to watch the fourth quarter of a game, you could watch that for 99 cents per game, I think is the price point. But the idea is like, that is going to become more and more common, and if blockchain technology can adapt or can make that come to fruition so that you are delivering something that the customer wants in more detail, that's helpful. Now, that is obviously a problem if you are an advertiser or if you're a company that relies on advertising. So this is something that Alex, he's developed our image identification platform in video, but having branded content having a branded integration into content is a pretty controversial topic. So right, if you're drinking Diet Coke right now, if all of a sudden I started drinking a Diet Coke and we were filming it, am I being paid to do that? Oh, that's true. Good point. Those types of branded integrations, sometimes they work well. So like when James Corden does carpool karaoke and they just happen to go to McDonald's, that wasn't by accident. McDonald's paid for him to go to go there as part of the video. But where sports particularly has an advantage is that sports has already established the fact that it will be branded content in the terms of logos, particularly on signs near the court or near the ice or near the field, or jersey patches. So that is already baked into the experience. So it could be, or one of our theories is it's possible that that type of branded content integration when it comes to logo activations within video will become increasingly valuable because that might be the primary or one of the primary ways you could actually advertise in sports content, which we've defined as lucrative content that generates a high audience. And if you're going to move away from traditional ad breaks or advertising or an advertising supported model altogether, that's an interesting application of blockchain and where it could go.
Yeah. I like a world where you can pay $1.99 to watch an NFL game on Sunday with no commercials, and the only activation is through the sponsorships that someone like Block 6 and Adam and Alex, they monitor and can help value those pieces. I think it works well from a consumer perspective, from a content creator perspective. It does cut out some people in the middle of the chain.
Yeah.
Those people have made money for a very long time, and I think they can adapt in many ways. But it's a really interesting application of how those things could work from a content perspective.
So a lot of what I've thought about and I'm hearing from you guys is that a lot of the applications, the good applications of blockchain technology come around the business of sports and not as much as like the on-field. It just seems like, you know, two totally unrelated things, blockchain and sports. When I heard about it, I was like, how do those things work together? But if you start thinking kind of A, outside the boundaries of cryptocurrency, B, outside the boundaries of in the game, on the field, there are a lot of opportunities around ticketing, around content, around security, around you know, advertising, any real supply chain management. All of the best opportunities seem to be in the business of sports. And I think that kind of leads into some good open questions about like what are the practical applications of blockchain? Can we not pigeonhole it for every use case? Can we identify the right use cases with, you know, legal, ethical, moral constraints, practical constraints, and really only use the right technology in the right places?
Yeah, so I think actually we mentioned this earlier, but the biggest on-field use of blockchain would be gambling, right? So sports gambling is something that obviously with the repeal of PAPSA, which was the legislation that banned sports betting except in Nevada and in some cases in New Jersey, now more and more states are enabling that. To start with, actually, it's not allowed. You can't even, in a lot of states, bet mobilely. Like you have to go to a casino or go to a place that a licensed operator of gambling. In the future, that will definitely change. What that opens up with gambling, and going to what Alex was saying from the ethical implications of on-field performance, is more and more frequently athletes are wearing these devices that track from a medical performance perspective information, you know, whether what is, you know, in the NFL, how much contact have they taken, how much sweat are they producing. That's not just the NFL, but there's all these different athletic biomarkers, how much sleep they're getting. In theory, again, from a blockchain perspective and from a legal and ethical perspective, you could sell that information, right? If the players' unions allowed for you to do that, and the players' unions would get their fair cut of the money in addition to the league, you could create an opportunity to sell that information in a blockchain type environment or through an Ethereum type environment where the information is the thing that is of value, right? And the information could then be used for gambling. More frequently, so that is one kind of ethical, what should athletes be selling that information? Should we be tracking that information? Should we be looking at people's medical history? Should we be, you know, Alex is saying, should we be able to unwind potentially somebody's public or private or public key to figure out who they are? That is all stuff we can definitely talk about. And we want to leave some time for questions. We're running towards the end of the process. But so that's a little more esoteric, but the main thing from a gambling perspective is, one of the reasons that PAPSA was in place to begin with is that betting is at least thought of as a very murky industry where the markets are made by bookies and it's not always clear if you make a bet that you're actually going to get the money from that transaction back. It's not clear where the transaction goes. It's not clear if it's being done by organized crime. There's just a lot of issues with sports betting, and the reason that the reason that it was banned is that the idea is that, and then the last thing from an on-field perspective is that athletes would bet on themselves or use inside information to bet on themselves. This issue is still an issue now with sports gambling being legal. There is no way at the moment to prevent an athlete to tell their friend to say, hey, this guy is injured, go bet for me on this, and their friend can go and bet on it. There is actually, at the moment, and maybe there is, we could talk, I don't know if there's a blockchain solution to that or not, but probably not. But that's one of the issues too, is that, and this happened at Northwestern actually directly. Northwestern was caught in a point shaving scandal on its own, where a player was shaving points because they were not paying, because he wanted to make extra money, and that opens up another door, is if you're gonna allow betting in college sports, and you can track the bets more frequently, should college athletes be paid for their content, for their information? So it opens up this whole world of questions that blockchain, as Alex said, blockchain is not the cure-all for all of these problems. There's certain things where it'll work well and certain things where it won't work well. But by far, and you can, even if you just looked up blockchain in sports right now on your phone, the biggest thing that'll come up will be gambling and what the impact on gambling would be.
Yeah. Gambling and tickets are the two big things. I think that as Adam mentioned, there's a lot of open-ended questions, and Alex mentioned it earlier, implementation details. I think how these things are implemented and the specific use cases that are found will be really interesting. There's a lot of open-ended questions, you know, things like, do we pay athletes in cryptocurrency? Can you buy a beer with Bitcoin at a stadium? Yep, all questions that are going to be answered. But I think the goal of today for us was to show, one, a complex technical concept that doesn't have to be that complex, that can be applied to something that we all know and love, sports. And I think that there's a lot of really practical applications to sports for this complex technical concept, that maybe not as complex as we think, that are starting to come into the market, but will continue over the next 5 to 10 years and continue to evolve. But with that, I think that, looking at time, are there questions that we have specifically around blockchain itself and or its application to sports?
So 2 quick questions. How hard is it for a team to actually create a blockchain? So what's involved in
Yeah.
actually making one, given the energy also involved? And 2, there's sort of it's going to be transparent, and yet cryptocurrency was anonymous. So tell me about the tug of war there.
Sure. So as far as the first question goes, you can always build an in-house solution, but a lot of the major cloud vendors have started building out blockchain platforms. So I know IBM has one.
Yeah, I mean, you could even go to ethereum.org, or I think you could just, it says like, do you want to start your own token or whatever? You just press a button and you can.
So for all practical purposes, blockchain is really pretty easy to implement. You give one person who knows how to code a weekend to do it, and they can get the bare bones of it up and going. As far as the second question, the pull between transparency and anonymity, that kind of raises that's kind of corollary to another question around sports, in that everything in sports is not decentralized. It's centralized to ESPN and the 32 NFL teams and 30 NHL baseball teams, whoever. We don't necessarily have that massively distributed network available in sports. And a big benefit of that distributed network is that it's much harder to figure out who people are. As far as transparency goes, we make a lot of sacrifices in our daily lives that put our privacy at risk. And so if that's something we're comfortable with doing, I'm sure sports organizations would love to get as much data about us as they could possibly get. But it's whether or not we are willing to make the sacrifice of what level of anonymity we're willing to sacrifice in order to get the convenience of blockchain, the security, the verifiability.
Oh, I wasn't really questioning privacy. I was actually questioning one of the reasons people liked cryptocurrency at the beginning was
Right.
the anonymity of
Right.
cryptocurrency.
Yeah, and actually building on what Alex says, the main way that sports organizations get your information now is almost the exact opposite of what blockchain was designed to do, right? It's you have to opt in and provide your information, whether it's on a ticketing platform, and most famously now, Facebook, right? You have to put in information into Facebook that then can be tracked, or Twitter to use the platforms, or if you're doing a Teams app, you have to put in your own information. So it is a good question. It's a question Alex obviously talked about before. From an economic perspective, for a sports organization, the more information they can get from you, the better. And if they can create a system that incentivizes you, and that's what they've tried to do, is you opt in, you get a certain benefit, right? You can get a better opportunity to get tickets. You can potentially meet the players. You can potentially, they're going to have to create some way to incentivize that in order to get the information effectively, because that is something that they're looking for. And again, it makes it, if you can incentivize it correctly, it makes it much more easy to track that information from an implementation perspective. But you're absolutely right. It will be constantly a push-pull kind of situation.
Yeah. Again, back to those implementation
Yeah.
details around what happens. Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah. Okay.
I had a question about the concept of forking. Does that mean that there's a discrepancy in the data then? Or?
So actually, the most famous example by far is the fork between Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. And now they're just two different cryptocurrencies. You can trace along both chains all the way back to the first Bitcoin block, the primordial block. There's no practical discrepancy, no technical discrepancy. It's just that they just split off. There are just now some places where the original Bitcoin is, and some places where Bitcoin Cash is. That kind of opens up another question about the security of blockchain. Like, can I force tickets to be forked and then create an alternate blockchain. I think the centralization around teams and around like the MLB, NHL, NFL, I think that's one good way of mitigating that issue. You know, there are a couple of big players who are going to be doing a lot of the transactions, but I don't think we should be terribly concerned about forking. Just
And just
as a practical
again, building up what Alex said, you know, the reason that, you know, anybody in theory could have set up a secondary ticket market. The reason that SeatGeek or StubHub at first and then SeatGeek was is they were able to attract people to use the platform. This is, I didn't think this originally, this is a unique opportunity, obviously, for if they can implement it correctly, for sports organizations to build these markets using cryptocurrency and or using blockchain technology and potentially take that back, where that if they could attract people into that place, then they could, and that would be one way, not the only way, certainly, but one way to prevent a fork is if people get the best, and that's what markets are, right? If people understand that this is the best place to do a transaction, they're not going to create a fork to do a separate transaction. If you're able to create a free flow of information and purchase.
Trust in the system.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
How is the ban or the push to ban net neutrality?
Push to ban net neutrality. How's the push to ban net neutrality? So I think it's a really good question. It's a really existential question that affects everybody in this room in many ways, especially people up here that make their lives using the internet in a lot of ways. I think the one, to me, and these guys may have a different opinion, to me the one way that it really affects the use of blockchain, not only in sports, but in other facets of business, is the ability of startup companies to, you know, have the bandwidth and the capital and the freedom of movement to create those companies, right? If you're somebody in your garage building a company that has a great idea, but you don't have the same level of access because you're throttled or have to in a different lane of this, you know, the internet, it thwarts that sort of innovation that companies can do from a startup perspective. I mean, Adam is someone that started a business on his own, right? And I think that having those barriers in place would be one of the biggest ways that net neutrality could hurt the implementation of a lot of these types of technologies.
Yeah, I actually have no idea. So.
Yeah, I think this comes back to, there's obviously the surrounding issues around blockchain, like, you know, can I make a blockchain startup, something, whatever. But I don't know if net neutrality fundamentally affects the technology of blockchain itself. Those things might not be directly related, and it might be the applications of blockchain that net neutrality affects more than the actual, you know, technology itself, than the actual ledger itself.
Yeah,
that would be my
You
guess.
have an idea now.
Now I do have a thought. It goes back to actually the content. You know, the biggest thing from a net neutrality perspective, right, is Netflix and content providers are taking up a huge part of the bandwidth that comes. And if you change how that works, potentially, if it becomes more efficient or it becomes easier, it potentially could impact it from a content distribution perspective because content is the thing that takes up. And that's what these, you know, whether it's Comcast or Verizon, it's, you know, they're potentially struggling and in competition with Netflix, which is part of the reason they're trying to push for a different lanes, so to speak, in the information highway. So it would be if content consumption patterns change, that would probably impact what that would look like. And it may bring in, you know, as Amazon, in particular, Amazon or Apple move in, or Facebook move into sports streaming, and they potentially move into this, you know, space in a more in-depth way, then that would impact potentially how this would look going forward, particularly, again, if content consumption patterns change.
All really good questions, and we wish we had time for a lot more of them, but we want to thank you, you know, for listening to us, and this is obviously the first time around for these pieces, but we're very happy to be the first ones to be up here to do it, and we hope that you learn something about from the technology perspective, but also the business perspective. I think that's what is the really interesting part about it, being able to implement it from a business perspective. So thank you all very much for your
Yes,
time.
thank you.